Hello and welcome, Reverend Suzanna Bates. I'm so glad that you're connecting with me today from Mill Bay. That's where you're living now. Is that correct?
It is. Hello there, Beth.
And Zoom kind of feels like some sort of resurrection where we don't have to be in the same place in the same time in order to have a meaningful conversation. So, welcome to this time of conversation. And when I thought about resurrection, which is a very a defining element of the Christian tradition. So, are you ready? Are you ready to tackle this very complex and very interesting conversation?
Well, we'll try our best. This is one of the toughest things to talk about, by the way.
I know. That's why I thought about you. So we did meet before this, just to let people know, to create a bit of a roadmap. So one place we thought we would start is just thinking about how uh, folks have talked about this, ancestors of faith have talked about this over a time. And we looked into the Apostles' Creed, and Jesus, descended to hell and on the third day rose again from the dead. In the Nicene Creed, he suffered death and was buried, and on the third day he rose in accordance with Scripture. And the United Church has evolved some of that thinking or perhaps contextualized it. We are called to be the church, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. In life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone. Interesting. The we are not alone is what we're most known for. So, Susanna, I wonder if you could just take a moment and reflect on that evolution of thought around resurrection.
Absolutely, Beth. Well, as you say, you mentioned those creeds of the church. Our church, the United Church of Canada, and the Church of the world over the centuries. This is the bedrock of our faith. I believe they are strong statements that speak to everything about the person. Um, and central in that whole creed, whatever other words they are, I think, well, the scholars tell us that the most important expression in that, on which everything hangs, every part of our faith hangs on those very words. I believe that he died and was crucified, descended to hell, etc. But the central piece is that he rose from the dead. He rose from the dead in accordance with the scriptures, says the Nicene Creed. Now that's kind of a thing that makes our minds boggle, especially our modern minds. It's difficult for us to grasp what resurrection means, and it's almost impossible to imagine what the resurrection of Jesus must have been like, even though it's absolutely part of our faith tradition and we know the story so well. But it is absolutely key to everything that we believe. And so I think it's really great that we're having a conversation about that today. It speaks about, when we look at the story of the church through the past, 2,000 years or so, we can see that everything that we believe and every church that we have, every expression of faith that we have, every church building, all of that, the history of the church, whether it's good or bad, in fact, hinges on this resurrection. Without it, it just simply wouldn't exist. It's been used to hurt, it's been used to heal. It's contentious, absolutely contentious. And I'm looking kind of forward to getting stuck in and seeing what the scriptures may say about this and how we might reflect on our faith tradition and also on the scriptures.
Yeah.
It does raise more questions than answers, though. So Beth, yeah, let's get a bit more stuck in.
Yeah, so as part of our adventures in faith, we sort of picked some of the hot topics in our faith tradition, and we could do weeks and weeks just on the resurrection. I think when we were speaking a little bit earlier, one of the points that we agreed upon, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that death does not have the last word. And so all this struggling about trying to reconcile the death and the resurrection, like you said, that our faith tradition hinges upon, raises more questions than answers. But death does not have the last word. So I thought just to dive into our uh, this tradition of resurrection, wondered if we could start with an understanding of what Jesus knew to be true about resurrection.
I think can safely imagine that what Jesus understood or knew about resurrection came directly from his own faith tradition and the stories that he was raised on as a boy, through the life of the synagogue, through the meetings of the community, through their faith stories, deeply rooted in the Hebrew scriptures. And there's some really exciting stories in the Bible about resurrection. I wonder if people know just how many accounts of body, physical resurrection there are in the scriptures. Well, we're about to tell you, and there might be one or two surprises in those stories. In the Hebrew scriptures, we read of 3 accounts of resurrection. And one story comes to us from the first book of Kings, chapter 17, where Elijah, one of the greatest prophets that lived, raised a young boy from death. We read about Elisha, who is the prophet that follows Elijah, who also is involved with a resurrection story, and he raises again another child from death, the son of the woman of Shunem. And we can find the story in 2 Kings chapter 4. And then the most interesting story for me about resurrection in the Hebrew scriptures also involves Elisha. And we can read this story in 2 Kings chapter 13. And it's, I think, a little known story, but hey, we read that Elisha, who is considered, again, one of the greatest prophets, he dies and he is buried. And on the same day of Elisha's burial, there is another funeral taking place nearby, in a grave nearby. And some other men were burying somebody else who died. And the grave diggers see that a band of Moabites is running towards them with malicious intent. And rather than risking an encounter, a clash with these Moabites, you see, they haven't finished digging that grave yet. They take the body of this other person and they throw him in Elisha's grave, just so that they could get out of there as quick as possible. And the scriptures tell us that when this other person's body touched the bones of the prophet Elisha, the man springs up back to life. He stands up on his feet, and I guess he takes off, running away from the Moabites. So those are 3 interesting accounts in the Hebrew scriptures about resurrection. There's a lot more in our faith tradition that carries on.
Yes, and in Jesus's lifetime, as we discerned, and thank you for all the notes here. That's what I'm doing when I'm looking up. There's a variety of people during Jesus's lifetime that he resurrected. Now, of course, this week we're going to be talking about his buddy Lazarus. Poor guy. Jesus is starting to understand that he is probably looking at his own death just by sharing this amazing message, the good news of the gospel. And he gets word, Mary and Martha are saying, look, Lazarus is really sick. And Jesus thinking, I don't really want to go there because something bad could happen to me. And then he has a thought or an intuition and knows that his friend is dead. So they walk over to Lazarus' home. And sure enough, he's been in the grave, as Jesus suspected, for 4 days. And goes to his friend. And, the favorite part of the Bible for most people is everybody says, well, it's going to be stinky in there because it's been 4 days. And Jesus chooses to raise him from the dead. Nobody asked Lazarus if he wanted this to happen, or really addresses what kind of shape he's in after he is resurrected. Yeah, I do think that's very a very interesting part of our Bible, that it's kind of the ordinary people that are raised and seem to have some kind of new life. Just ordinary lives. Like it's not like when something happens that poor man that was in the tomb for the Hebrew scriptures, the one that you shared, sorry. Can you share the name of that poor lad that was raised? Oh, we don't know. Just sort of
no, it's just a man, somebody.
Just a man, right? He didn't go on to be something extra special in the eyes of God or in the hearts of the people. He just continued somewhat of an ordinary life.
Yes, that's certainly our understanding. I mean, he may have, but he was no Superman. And we also find some more stories of just really ordinary people in the New Testament. In the scriptures that we read, the gospel stories, read about a child, a little girl. And I think it's so poignant, the story. She gets sick and she dies. She's the daughter of Jairus, and Jairus is one of the leaders of the synagogue. And they send for Jesus. This little girl is on her deathbed, but she dies. And Jesus comes and takes her hand and lifts her up, and she is raised from death. We can read that story in Luke chapter 8. There's a couple of, another story of another ordinary person. We don't even know these people's names. No, we don't even know the mother's name. We read about the son of a widow, the widow of Nain. We read that story in Luke chapter 7. And you mentioned there Lazarus. I mean, he was a beloved friend of Jesus. So in that way, I guess he wasn't just an ordinary guy, but he was a run-of-the-mill ordinary guy. He was just, he was somebody close. Then we read in the scriptures another. Well, this is not an ordinary story. I mean, it truly isn't. It's a bit like that story about the guy being thrown into Elisha's grave. We read in Matthew chapter 27 that when Matthew's account, right, of Jesus's death. So the scripture says this: when Jesus died, the earth shook and the rocks split open and the tombs broke open. It's like a horror movie, this, Beth. It's honestly, you couldn't imagine what this must have been like. Well, we read in the scriptures that those tombs remained open until the third day. And goes on to say, at that time, the bodies of many holy people were raised to life, and they came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection, and they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Now, I wonder how many of us have heard that story, or maybe we have, but because it's so weird and extraordinary, it's actually gone out of our minds.
Well, it's certainly not in the lectionary, right? Yes.
Like stories like that because, well, they seem so surreal. They're way beyond our experience, and in some ways they're even beyond our talking about them, because how can we understand that? I mean, could we actually imagine that? I mean, this is long before Hollywood, right? So these are incredible stories that raise such huge questions in us. When the Bible carries on, that's not the end of resurrection, by the way, in the scriptures. There are other people too. A woman called Tabitha. We can read the story in Acts chapter 9, and it says that she was a good woman. She was a follower of Jesus. And when she died, the believers in Joppa were terribly sad. They were distraught over her death. And so Peter goes and, well, he raises her from death. Tabitha, get up, he says to her. And so she sits up. The other story, is of the resurrection is a name that we may not even ever have heard, but it's a young guy, young man, the scripture says in Acts chapter 20, and tells us that Eutychus, well, there's a tragic story here. He's sitting in the window, on the windowsill, and he's looking out and he's listening to Paul preach below, and he dozes off. I think that was a long sermon, a bit like mine. and, and he slips and he falls down 3 stories, splat onto the ground. And you can imagine what church must have been like that day. It was horrific. But Paul runs down, and the scripture says he threw himself down on this young man, and he put his arms around him, and Eutychus comes back to life. He goes upstairs, and he has supper with the others. I mean, those are incredible stories. And then, of course, there's the big one himself. You tell us about that, Beth.
Our story comes from the Gospel of Mark. Mary Magdalene and a few other women went to the tomb. They were worried about the big stone that was placed in front of the tomb, but when they got there, the stone was rolled away, and they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe. He said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified and risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he has gone before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for they were trembling in astonishment. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Yeah, what's really interesting is the number of ways that Jesus is seen in kind of the post-resurrection. Sometimes he's seen in flesh and blood. Sometimes he's seen as a spirit. Sometimes people can put their hands through him. Sometimes they see physical wounds. Sometimes he's cooking people. He also appeared like walking on water. So there seems in each gospel, there's a different view of how resurrection is possible in sort of how Jesus manifests to a variety of people in the gospel. And these stories we're very familiar with. So what it feels like to me we do in our faith tradition is we've pretty much zeroed down on Jesus's resurrection and then the post-resurrection stories that are just about him. But I think it's really interesting to hear the history, what Jesus actually knew, and then that resurrection didn't just happen with Jesus as the central person, as you noted in your last story in that messy church day. It was Peter who went and put his arms around him. So resurrection is possible, which is just very eye-opening to me. That brings me to a question or two, given even the short time talking about resurrection. How does this impact your faith?
Well, truth is, we can tell all these fantastic stories, and they are fantastic. We can have biblical knowledge. We can know things. We can believe things. But I guess it always gets me back to that question, so what? But these stories in the scriptures and what is going on, if that can't change us in some way, then I don't quite know. So I can't tell you what it's like, what death and resurrection is like. I've not been there. And I may not even be raised. In fact, I probably won't, and many people will say you shouldn't be. But and sometimes I'm not even sure what to believe about those things. But what I do know, and what I believe with all my heart, that we matter to God, that our life and our bodies and our flesh and cells and atoms matter to God, because God is in all. And every life matters, everything matters to God, who is the great creator, from whom all life springs. And so I really do believe in resurrection. In life where there was once death, like seeds that appear to be dead or sleeping, dormant. And when they are awakened in the right soil and with some water and with a tiny bit of love, such incredible new life can can be raised up. So, what is your thoughts?
Well, you can see that as we've talked, they've evolved. And I think this part of the making meaning in my life is to have the opportunity to have great conversations with wonderful people. Um, I just was chatting with someone earlier saying, make a mind map, write down what you thought about a topic like resurrection when you began to think about it, and write down some notes as you evolve. And what do you think about it now? How have you been moved? So this has been an eye-opening study for me, and to have this kind of an encounter with you, having these kind of conversations. And I didn't recognize how much resurrection was part of the Hebrew faith tradition. That's my answer. All right. So thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, Susanna. And we'll talk again soon about something. We'll talk about doubt next week.
Well, that's a lot easier than resurrection. I've got a lot more experience, Beth.
Yeah, very true. Thanks so much.
No, really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much.